On July 30th, 1863, a boy named Henry Ford was born on a farm in Springwells Township, Michigan, the eldest son of a farmer named William Ford. 75 years later, to the day, that same man stood in Dearborn and accepted a medal from the German government, the Grand Cross of the Supreme Order of the German Eagle, the highest honor the Nazi state gave to any foreigner, and the first ever given to an American. Adolf Hitler had called him an inspiration. In the years between those two dates, Ford built a company, a factory, and eventually a town around his own name, and staffed its enforcement wing with a man named Harry Bennett, whose private police answered to Ford alone, not to Ford's own son and company president Edsel, who held the title but rarely the authority that should have come with it. The town Ford built for his family and his workers has outlasted nearly every name attached to it. Today it carries his surname on a hospital and a museum. Over a population his own Sociological Department would not have recognized as fit for citizenship at all. This is the story of the kingdom Henry Ford built for his family, and how quietly it stopped listening to them. Chapter 1. The Machine in the Farm Boy's Pocket. Dearborn sits on flat land, the kind good for nothing but growing things. The River Rouge cuts through it in slow bends, feeding soil so fertile that by the middle of the 19th century, the farms along its banks were among the most productive in Wayne County. A few miles east, Detroit was already pulling the region's ambition toward it. A river port, a rail junction, a city where the lines converged before running north, south, and west into the rest of Michigan. Dearborn was not that city. Dearborn was what a man passed through or farmed on his way to it. William Ford farmed it well. An immigrant son who had turned inherited acreage into a prosperous operation of grain and livestock, he held the kind of standing in Springwells Township that came from land, not ambition. The quiet respectability of a man who paid his debts and expected his sons to take up the plow behind him. On July 30th, 1863, his wife Mary bore their first child in the farmhouse 2 miles west of Dearborn Village. They named him Henry. 5 more children would follow, and William Ford, by every account available, expected all of them, but especially his eldest, to inherit not just the farm but the temperament that ran it. He did not get that son. He got a boy who walked 2 miles each morning to a one-room schoolhouse in the Dearborn School District, sat through arithmetic and penmanship until he was 15, and spent every hour outside that schoolroom, finding reasons to be somewhere other than the fields. He had no feel for livestock, no patience for the rhythms of planting and harvest that had built his father's fortune. What he had instead was a compulsion for mechanism. By 9, he was dismantling pocket watches on the kitchen table, laying out their gear trains like a surgeon laying out instruments, then reassembling them by lamplight until they ran true again. Neighbors began bringing him their broken timepieces. He fixed them for nothing, because the fixing was the point. It was not only watches. Steam engines fascinated him the way Scripture fascinates a young priest, not casually, but as the outline of a life. He studied the traction engines that occasionally rumbled down the country roads near Dearborn with an attention he never gave the wheat. He took apart farm machinery his father needed for the next morning's work and reassembled it before dawn, less out of guilt than curiosity satisfied. The soil under his boots was the same soil that had made William Ford a man of means, the same river that would 4 decades later run alongside the largest industrial complex on Earth and put his son's name on maps in a dozen countries. To Henry Ford at 12, at 13, at 14, it was none of that. It was ground to be crossed, not worked. He hated the farm the way some men hate a room they cannot leave, not the animals themselves. He showed no particular cruelty toward them, no particular tenderness either. Not the neighbors, who liked him well enough. Not even entirely his father. though the two would spend years failing to understand each other. What he hated was the repetition, the dependence on weather and soil, and the slow accumulation of a single season's yield. When a watch could be broken and rebuilt in an afternoon, and a steam cylinder understood completely by a boy patient enough to take it apart enough times. Machinery answered him back in a way the land never did. William Ford watched his eldest son's fascination with something between tolerance and concern, the concern of a man who had built a life on the very ground his son was already mentally leaving. How far the boy intended to go, William could only guess. At 15, Henry Ford would leave the one-room schoolhouse behind for good. Not for another farm, not for another township, but for the workshops of Detroit, carrying with him a watch he had by then taken apart more times than anyone in Springwells Township could count. Chapter 2. 2 Failures and a Cheap Car. He apprenticed as a machinist in Detroit's shops along the river, then rose to chief engineer at the Edison Illuminating Company, tending dynamos for a business that had nothing to do with automobiles. The work was steady, and it paid him a wage his father would have understood. Regular, respectable, entirely beside the point. It also paid enough to keep him experimenting after hours, in a brick shed behind his house, on nights the plant did not need him. It did not hold him. In 1899, at 36 years old, he resigned from Edison and put his own name on an automobile company for the first time. Detroit that year had a dozen men trying the same thing, in workshops not unlike his own, each convinced he alone understood where the engine was going. Few of them had his stubbornness. The Detroit Automobile Company did not survive to see its second anniversary. Ford wanted better cars. His backers wanted faster returns. The two positions proved incompatible, and by 1901 the company dissolved, its tools and inventory auctioned off, its name retired without ceremony. He tried again within the year, before the ink on the first failure had fully dried. The Henry Ford Company opened that same season, financed by men who trusted his engineering more than they trusted his temperament. And inside months they trusted the second judgment enough to remove him from the company carrying his own name. He walked away with nothing but the lesson. What remained became Cadillac. Failure in Detroit in 1901 was not yet a verdict. It was tuition, and expensive tuition at that. He had learned what kind of investor he could not work with. He had learned what kind of car he actually wanted to build. He had learned how little patience he had for boardrooms that believed they outranked the workshop. In 1903, he tried a third time, this time closer to his own terms, and Ford Motor Company incorporated that June with $28,000 raised from a dozen local investors, among them the brothers John and Horace Dodge, who extended engines and running gear on credit nearly as often as they extended cash. 2 failures behind him, 39 years old, he had one company left in which to get it right, and no third act waiting if this one failed too. The company survived its first years on margins thin enough to worry the men who had signed the checks. It redesigned its lineup season after season, each new model closer to what Ford wanted and further from anything the investors had originally bargained for. Money stayed short. Patience on both sides stayed shorter still. The cars sold well enough to keep the doors open, never quite well enough to settle the argument over what the company was actually for. A toy for those who could afford one, or a machine for everyone else. Then, in August 1908, the argument ended and the redesigning stopped. Ford called it the Model T and priced it at $850 against comparable automobiles selling for $2,000 to $3,000, a gap wide enough to put a car within reach of families who had never once expected to own one. It was built plain and built for punishment, for the ruts and washouts and river-bottom mud of roads that were, outside a handful of cities, barely roads at all. Other manufacturers built for the wealthy few who could afford both the car and its upkeep. Ford built for the farmer, the clerk, the small-town doctor making his rounds. For people who had never before been asked what they wanted from an automobile because no one selling one had thought to ask, orders reached the Paquette Avenue plant faster than the plant could fill them, and kept coming faster still. The line that would one day fill them fast enough was still 5 years away. Chapter 3. The Marsh and the Machine. By the last months of 1913, the man who had failed twice at building cars in Detroit was no longer merely building them well. At the Highland Park plant, workers stopped moving toward the automobile and let the automobile move toward them. A chassis pulled along a belt at a walking pace, parts arriving at each station in the exact order they were needed. Nothing wasted, nothing wandering. A Model T that had taken more than 12 hours to assemble by hand came off the line in roughly 90 minutes. It was not a shortcut. It was not an efficiency measure. It was a redefinition of what a factory was for, and the car that had launched 5 years earlier at $850 could now be built for a fraction of that in labor alone. Ford was no longer selling automobiles. He was selling a method. The savings moved downward, year after year, straight into the price tag. $850 in 1908 became $600 by the middle of the decade, then kept falling, until by 1925, a new Model T left the lot for less than $300, cheaper by then than many of the bicycles it had once competed against. More than 15 million would be built before the line finally stopped in 1927. At the method's peak, close to 4 of every 10 cars on American roads wore the same black paint and the same oval badge. Ford, the machinist who had twice gone broke trying to start a company, became one of the richest men alive before he turned 50. The fortune arrived in figures that had rarely been attached to one man before, hundreds of millions of dollars, compounding faster than anyone bothered to track precisely. Money of that size needs somewhere to go. In 1915, Ford sent 2,000 acres of it toward a stretch of marshland along the River Rouge, low ground of reed and scrub with no factory drawn anywhere near it. The stated purpose was almost sentimental, a private bird sanctuary, a quiet wetland where a man who had spent a decade accelerating the world might watch something slow down instead. He bought the land outright, put no machinery on it, and for a short while it stayed exactly what he said it would be. Nothing about the purchase suggested industry, nothing about it suggested war. The birds did not get long. In 1917, the United States entered the fighting in Europe, and Washington came to Dearborn asking not for sanctuary, but for hulls, small wooden patrol boats needed by the dozen to hunt submarines off the Atlantic coast. Ford answered with a Navy contract to build them at the Rouge, close to 100 vessels, worth on the order of $20 million, laid down on marsh that 18 months earlier had held nothing heavier than a heron. The sanctuary closed before it had properly opened. What replaced it did not. By the time the last of those hulls slid down its launching way, the 2,000 acres were no longer a purchase. They were a foundation, dredged, drained, threaded already with rail spur and dock. No plant stood on it yet. But the marsh had shown in the space of 2 years that it could become almost anything Ford decided to build there, at almost any dollar figure he chose to spend. What he would decide, and how much of it he would eventually hand to a son he had not yet finished doubting, was still a matter for later. Chapter 4. The $5 Condition. On January 5, 1914, Ford announced a minimum wage of $5 for an 8-hour day. The prevailing rate at his own plant had been roughly $2.34 for 9 hours, a number that made the new figure look less like a raise and more than double what it replaced for a shift shorter than the one it replaced. Newspapers ran it on front pages as though a factory owner had lost his mind. Competitors called it reckless, even suicidal, the kind of gesture that would bankrupt a company inside a year. Ford let them talk. He had already worked out that a workforce paid enough to buy the cars it built would not need convincing to stay through the churn that had been costing him more in retraining alone than the raise itself. The arithmetic was cold. The announcement was not charity. What went unmentioned in most of the coverage was the condition attached to it. $5 was not a wage. It was a wage plus a bonus, and the bonus had to be earned by proving to Ford's satisfaction that a man deserved it. To administer that judgment, Ford created something new inside an automobile company, a sociological department, placed under an Episcopal minister named Samuel Marquise, whose job was not to build cars, but to determine which of Ford's employees qualified as the right kind of American to receive full pay for building them. The standard Marquis was asked to enforce was not industrial, it was domestic. A man had to abstain from alcohol. He could not beat his wife or his children. He could not take in boarders or lodgers to supplement his income. The department considered that a sign of financial disorder, not resourcefulness. His home had to be kept clean, inspected and verified as clean, and he had to be saving money on a regular schedule. The sums recorded and reviewed. Not a factory rule, an actual house rule, applied to men who had already clocked 8 hours on Ford's floor before anyone came to look at how they lived off it. To enforce that standard, the department sent roughly 50 investigators out from Highland Park in Ford automobiles, driving directly to workers' homes. Because the workforce was heavily immigrant, Poles, Hungarians, Italians, Armenians, men who had crossed an ocean for the wage now dangling in front of them. The investigators traveled with interpreters so that a question about drinking habits or a wife's bruises could be asked and answered without translation left to guesswork. They walked into kitchens, they opened cupboards, they asked neighbors what they knew. A man who failed the inspection did not lose his job. He simply never saw the other half of his pay, and there was no appeal built into the process beyond doing better and waiting for the next visit. The scale of it was, by any measure, without precedent. No other manufacturer in the country had built a department whose purpose was to police the private conduct of its employees as a condition of pay. And none had sent 50 men door to door with interpreters to confirm compliance. It worked in the narrow sense that turnover fell and productivity climbed, and the newspapers eventually stopped calling Ford reckless. It also established something that would outlast the department itself, that in Ford's system, $5 bought not only labor, but the right to inspect a life. The Sociological Department would not survive the decade. By 1921, it was gone in all but name, folded away as quietly as it had been announced. What replaced it would not knock first. Chapter 5. The Kingdom Complete. Control, having left the workers' kitchen in Chapter 4, moved next to the land itself. Between 1917 and 1928, on the 2,000 acres Ford had bought in 1915. Once marsh, briefly a shipyard, now something considerably larger. The River Rouge complex rose ring by ring until it was no longer a factory in any sense the word had carried a decade earlier. It was a steel mill and a glass plant, a power plant feeding current to buildings that did not yet exist when the excavation began, and a private fleet of ore boats working the Great Lakes, hauling raw material to a dock built for exactly that purpose. Iron ore went in one end. A finished automobile came out the other, roughly 28 hours later, having touched no other man's factory along the way. By the time it was finished in 1928, the Rouge employed more than 100,000 men, a number that would climb toward 120,000 within 15 years, moving as many as 4,000 finished vehicles off the line in a single day. Paid at Ford's own $5 standard, that morning's wages alone ran past $500,000 before the first car of the shift had cleared the gate. Historians and press agents settled, without much argument, on the same description: the largest integrated industrial complex on Earth. At the high dock in the autumn of 1928, freighters idled at the ore wall, unloading into a mountain of raw material that would be steel by nightfall. The glass plant's stacks exhaled white against a sky already gray with the open hearth smoke, and underfoot the ground itself hummed. The power plant alone generated more current than most American cities drew. 28 hours later, a portion of that ore would sit on a dealership lot somewhere in Ohio, badged and painted, as though it had never been rock. Nothing here yet hinted at what the men who ran it would become. Upstream of all that heat and iron, on a bend of the same river, sat the house Ford had built for his family in 1915 and 1916. Fair Lane, 31,000 square feet, 56 rooms of Marblehead limestone, its own dam and hydroelectric plant supplying power the local utility never touched, its gardens laid out by the landscape architect Jens Jensen to look as though nothing had been laid out at all. The family moved in that January. It was not a house. It was an actual private nation, with its own light, its own water, its own governed weather of clipped lawn and native prairie grass. And yet the man who had built it kept banks at arm's length, distrusted doctors, and waved off outside experts on nearly everything, running his household the way he ran the Rouge, on instinct, alone, answerable to no one. The same instinct reached past the factory gates and into the incorporation papers. On June 12, 1928, the townships of Dearborn and Fordson voted to merge into a single city, and the new charter took effect on January 9, 1929. Population told the story better than any charter language could. About 4,500 people in 1912 when Ford had first started buying land along the river. More than 50,000 by the time the ink dried. The city took its name from a general who had fought the War of 1812 and had nothing to do with automobiles, but by 1929, the name on the map mattered less than the name on the payroll. Dearborn, Michigan, was in every sense but the legal one a company town wearing a charter. By 1929, Henry Ford had built a factory that ran itself. He had built a house that answered to no utility company. He had built a city that answered in substance, if not in law, to nothing but his own name. 3 kingdoms, 1 signature behind all of them. And already inside the gates of the largest of the 3, men were being hired for a different kind of work, not to build anything at all. And Chapter 6, The International Jew. In 1920, Ford bought a failing weekly out of Dearborn, 12 pages of local notices and church socials. He had not bought it to build circulation for its own sake. Every dealership in the country was told to carry the paper. Some ordered to buy bundles outright. Others held to a subscription quota built into the franchise agreement. And within 2 years, circulation reached into the hundreds of thousands. A paper almost nobody had asked for, delivered by contract rather than by appetite. That same year, the paper began running a series under the title The International Jew. It ran for 2 years, always under Ford's own name and authority, and it claimed a conspiracy controlling the nation's finance, its newspapers, its entertainment, presented not as accusation, but as discovery. Laid out issue after issue, as though it were simple reporting. The material was collected afterward into pamphlet form, then book form, and it traveled. It was translated into German and circulated there through the decade. Adolf Hitler would later describe Henry Ford, publicly, as an inspiration. Ford did not write the German editions. He signed the American ones that made them possible. In 1925, Aaron Shapiro sued him. Shapiro organized agricultural cooperatives for a living, farmers pooling grain and produce to negotiate against buyers on equal terms, and the paper had spent months naming him as an instrument of the conspiracy it claimed to be exposing. He filed for libel. The case took 2 years to reach a jury, and in 1927, the trial ended the way these cases ended when the evidence turned dangerous. A mistrial declared amid allegations that at least 1 juror had been reached and paid. Ford did not risk a second trial. At the end of 1927, he closed the Dearborn Independent outright. 7 years of publication, gone inside a single announcement, and signed a public apology. He called himself, in it, deeply mortified. The apology was written by Lewis Marshall, an attorney, not by Ford, and its language shifted responsibility onto subordinates, men below him who had supposedly acted alone, for 7 years, under his name, on his letterhead. Distributed through his dealerships by his own company policy, he had not necessarily written the articles. He had not necessarily written the apology either. He had signed both. 2 years later, on October the 21st, 1929, Ford dedicated a museum. He built it in Dearborn and named it for Thomas Edison, timed to the 50th anniversary of the electric light, and he filled it not with replicas, but with the buildings themselves. The Wright brothers' bicycle shop taken apart and reassembled board by board, Edison's Menlo Park laboratory dismantled and rebuilt on ground Ford owned outright. It was a museum of American invention, and Ford alone decided what belonged inside it, what story it told, whose name appeared on the plaques and whose did not. He had once decided alone what a few 100,000 readers would be told about who controlled their country. Now he decided alone what history itself would look like under glass. The dedication ran late into the evening. Edison himself was there, an old man now, walked through rooms built to enshrine his own life's work. 8 days later, the stock market opened on a Tuesday that would not need a name beyond its date. Chapter 7. The Service Department and the President Who Explained. The Crash. 8 days past the museum's dedication did not stay confined to Wall Street tickers. By the winter of 1932, Dearborn counted its unemployed in the tens of thousands, and on the morning of March 7th, more than 3,000 of them marched from Detroit toward the gates of the River Rouge plant. Dearborn was a company town in every sense the word allowed, and the marchers reached its border already watched. Dearborn police opened fire on the crowd, and so did men from Ford's own service department, dispatched from inside the gates they were meant to guard. 4 marchers died where they fell: Joe Bussell, Joe York, Coleman Lenny, Joe de Blasio. A 5th, Curtis Williams, died of his wounds some 5 months later. As many as 60 more were wounded. On March 12th, a funeral procession carried the dead through Detroit, and roughly 60,000 people walked behind them. No one was ever charged. The men who fired from inside the gates answered to one department, and that department answered to one man. Harry Bennett had been a boxer before Ford found him, a compact and watchful man with no patent to his name, no engineering degree, and no seat on any board that mattered on paper. What he built instead was a private police force, run out of a basement office at the Rouge, that by the middle of the decade numbered in the thousands and answered to no authority inside the plant but his own. He staffed part of it with men recruited straight out of prison. Where Edsel Ford held a title, Bennett held leverage, and leverage proved the more durable currency inside the Rouge. Bennett answered to Henry Ford directly. He did not answer to Edsel Ford, the company's president of record, and everyone inside the Rouge understood the distinction long before anyone said it aloud. Authority in this kingdom had stopped following the org chart. It followed loyalty, and loyalty ran in one direction only. 5 years after the march, Bennett's department produced its most photographed morning. On May 26, 1937, United Auto Workers organizers Walter Reuther and Richard Frankenstein climbed a pedestrian overpass near the Rouge to distribute leaflets. Service department men met them on the steps, beat both organizers in view of the assembled press photographers, and beat other bystanders alongside them. The photographs ran the next morning in newspapers from Detroit to New York. Ford had spent 3 decades building a name meant to signal decency, $5 wages, and progress measured in something other than margin. The pictures undid more of that name in a single week than a decade of critics had managed between them. Public opinion turned. It did not turn back. Edsel Ford had held the presidency since 1919, elevated at 25 to a title his father never fully let him occupy. He approved designs his father overruled without explanation and set policy his father reversed in front of the men who worked for both of them. In practice, he answered not only to Henry Ford but to Harry Bennett, a man who held no office and ranked above him and deferred to him in nothing at all. For more than 2 decades, Edsel opened meetings whose outcomes had already been settled elsewhere, signed memoranda whose weight Bennett could erase with a single telephone call, and carried, in every public photograph, the title of President of the Ford Motor Company. Not the president who decided, the president who explained. By the early 1940s, the men who worked closest to him described someone visibly worn past his years, though the company's public face gave no hint of it. Biographers have traced his decline across those same years, though no single incident marks where it began. On May 26, 1943, the same date, 6 years turned over exactly as the beating on the overpass, Edsel Ford died of stomach cancer at 49. His father outlived him. Harry Bennett outlived him too, his position at the company unshaken for the moment. The presidency stood open again, and the name now attached to it belonged to a 26-year-old Ford, fresh out of the Navy. A man who had never run so much as a single department. His name was Henry Ford II. Chapter 8. The Kingdom Without a King. In the summer of 1943, the federal government intervened directly in the succession of the Ford Motor Company, the only time in the company's history that Washington forced the issue. The Rouge plant was turning out bombers, tanks, and Jeep engines under war contracts the government could not afford to see interrupted, and the man nominally running the company was 80 years old and slipping further from coherent judgment by the month. The Navy released Lieutenant Henry Ford II from active duty and sent him home to Dearborn. He was 26. He had never run so much as a single department, and he was walking into a company still governed, in practice, by a private police force that answered to no one but his grandfather. That grandfather had 5 years earlier accepted the highest honor the German state gave to a foreigner, pinned to his chest in Dearborn, while Adolf Hitler called him an inspiration. By 1943, the man capable of explaining that choice was largely gone, replaced by an old man prone to sudden rages and stranger convictions, propped up in the company's daily operations by Harry Bennett, whose service department had spent a decade enforcing a version of loyalty that looked, on most days, like intimidation. Edsel had died trying to hold the line against both of them. His son inherited the job without inheriting the authority. He took the authority within 2 years. In September 1945, within weeks of gaining real control of the company, Henry Ford II fired Harry Bennett outright and ordered the service department dissolved. The men who had patrolled the Rouge's gates, tapped its phones, and kept files on workers' private lives were gone before the month was out. It was the fastest reversal of power the company had ever seen. The founder did not live to see much of what followed. On April 7, 1947, Henry Ford died at Fair Lane, the estate he had built on the Rouge River 30 years before, of a cerebral hemorrhage. He was 83. He left behind a fortune that, by any accounting, ranked among the largest ever assembled by an American, and a grandson who would spend the decades that followed rebuilding the company around the wreckage of his rule. 80 years after his death, the company's headquarters still stood in Dearborn. The Rouge complex had shrunk from the 2,000 acres it once covered to roughly 600, though it remained Ford's largest single plant and continued to build vehicles. The museum and the village he had built to house his version of American history kept their doors open every morning to paying visitors. Almost everything he had built still stood. What had changed was who lived around it. The 2020 census counted 109,976 residents of Dearborn. The American Community Survey 3 years later found that more than half of them traced their ancestry to the Middle East or North Africa, the first Arab-majority city the United States had ever recorded. Ford's Sociological Department had once sent inspectors into workers' homes to grade them on how thoroughly they had become the right kind of American. The city he left behind closed the book on that definition of citizenship without asking his permission. The Rouge River runs past the limestone retaining walls of Fair Lane now, low and brown under the willows, the same width it was when Ford dammed a stretch of it for his own hydroelectric plant. Downstream, past the museum, past the shrunken plant, it passes under the same iron bridges his engineers built to carry it where he wanted. In the late afternoon, the water goes the color of weak tea, and a heron sometimes stands in it, motionless, waiting. It is a small river, dammed and diverted, and put to work by a man who wanted to own even its current, and it answers to none of that now. It still finds its way to the lake.